In the Bible, when men made predictions for the future, the people expected them to come true. Is there a lesson here for scientists predicting climate change? Who should you trust for predicting the future in this episode of The 10th Man? Every year on the Sunday of Epiphany, Catholics, Anglicans, and other Christians celebrate the visit of the Magi, the three wise men, to the Christ child in Bethlehem. Many people believe the Bible to be a book that is inspired and inerrant. For those who do not, who think it is a collection of fables, the way this story unfolds is still instructive. The New Testament comprises about a quarter of the Bible by volume. It begins with the four Gospels, 4 books telling the life of Jesus, each one slightly different from the other. In the second chapter of Matthew, the very first book, the writer says that wise men from the east came to Jerusalem after Jesus was born and asked Herod the king where they might find the baby. The king summoned the priests and teachers and asked them the question, to which they replied, Bethlehem. So the wise men went to Bethlehem, and there was baby Jesus. Wouldn't the climate scientists be delighted to have such a response to their predictions, and everyone taking them at their word? In the Bible story, everybody present simply accepted that the prophecy would be correct. Even if it's a fable where the political leaders of Jerusalem opened the scriptures, saw what it said, passed it on to the wise men, and everyone acted on it with no doubt that it was true. Previously, in the Old Testament times, when God's communication was largely through human prophets, He laid out the guidelines early in the ancient book of Deuteronomy. False prophets should be put to death, and one who predicted an event which did not come to pass, he was a false prophet. When Herod called the priests and teachers of the church before him, he was calling the equivalent of the scientists of today, and part of their store of knowledge was the Old Testament prophets. Theirs was not the science we know with its empiricism and the scientific method, but to Herod, they were the intellectual elite, the best brains of the land, even if their basis was in religion. Although the prophecy was accurate in this story, that was not always the case. There have been many false prophets in the church. False prophets have claimed various supernatural powers and have made predictions about the end of the world. They do this to attract followers and to gain power, prestige, and money. Founders of some well-known religions illustrate this. William Miller was a 19th century Baptist minister and founder of the Seventh-day Adventists. Miller determined by his interpretation of Old Testament prophecy that the world was going to end sometime in 1843. He didn't offer his life if he was wrong, but admitted that he should be ostracized for his error. When the year was up, he gave a new date of March 1844, then changed that to October. He died in 1849 and might have avoided embarrassment in his lifetime by predicting the end of the world after his own death. Charles Russell, another Christian minister, predicted the end of the world first in 1878. He and his church, the Jehovah's Witnesses, then predicted the world would end in 1881, 1914, 1918, 1925, and more recently in 1975. Finally, they said they knew for sure that it would end with the 20th century. They were wrong again and again, but simply changed their message, explained away the error, and retained their following. There have been many end-of-the-world scenarios in the church. The cartoon of an old man carrying a sign saying, "The end is near," was a meme of the mid-20th century poking fun at these people. All these men failed in recognizing the two big lessons of Bible prophecy. First, the Old Testament prophets did not predict some immediate disaster and then set themselves up as leaders of a new church to capitalize on it. They lived, prophesied, and generally died in poverty well before the events came to pass. Second, Jesus said that no man will ever correctly predict the end of the world. That's a bold statement, but so far, 2,000 years later, and after hundreds of challenges by both believers and skeptics predicting the end, it's still correct. Even if they think Jesus is a myth, climate scientists should pay attention. Back when the church was the center of power, false prophets sprang up in the church. They're the same kind of people working in the climatist movement today. Nowadays, the church's power is waning and government places more power in the sciences. As a result, the The false prophets now enter the sciences because that's where the power lies. It's just human nature. It is no surprise, then, that the record of false prophecy in the sciences is a long one. In 1499, German mathematician and astronomer Johann Stoeffler allegedly predicted the world would be destroyed by flood in 1524. That gave people 20 years to prepare, and the media spread pamphlets across the land dramatizing the coming end. The boat-building business took advantage of the panic, building escape craft for anyone with cash. One man, Count von Ingelheim, built an ark for himself, his family, and his friends. When he went to board the ark, it began to rain, and the resentful peasants rioted. Hundreds died in the panic, including the Count, who was killed by the mob. Although several scientists had said there would be no flood, the masses wouldn't listen to common sense. Ironically, not only was there no flood, but that year, in fact, was a drought. Climate change predictions based on science were off to a bad start. As the prophets of doom continued to move away from a religious basis for their authority and more into the scientific area, the heavens, and especially comets, were an inspiration. One example was Halley's Comet, which returned to visit Earth in 1910. In France, they blamed Halley's for disastrous climate change when the River Seine flowing through Paris overflowed its banks. There were other predictions, but the greatest impact came from the Yerkes Observatory in Chicago. Scientists there said that they had discovered poisonous gas in the tail of the comet. It was known that the Earth would pass through the comet's tail on the night of May 18th, and a French astronomer said it could snuff out all life. The announcements were made in February, and there was plenty of time to induce panic, and plenty of time for charlatans to create an anti-comet medicine and sell protective masks. When May 18th arrived, some people took refuge in sealed, safe rooms they had created. Some committed suicide, some gathered to pray, and some got drunk, preferring to be unconscious when death arrived. And there were some who trusted God's word that only He knew when the earth was to be destroyed, and they had comet parties that night. As much as a belief in God would have prevented the panic, they did not actually have to believe in God. They only had to disbelieve all the self-appointed experts who said they knew what was going to happen. The critical thinker is not an individual who knows all the answers. Rather, he is an individual who can separate the experts from the fakers. An overabundance of faith in scientists who have never proven themselves right leads to disaster. In modern times, there are lots of opportunities to sort out the fakers. In 1970, Stanford University's Paul Ehrlich predicted millions of deaths by starvation, with a famine caused by overpopulation peaking in 1975. Hedging his bets, he predicted in 1969 that pollution would wipe out mankind by 1990. When none of this happened, he simply took credit for saving the world, even though he had originally said it was already too late to avoid disaster. The predictions are in his book, The Population Bomb, which sold 2 million copies and influenced government policy. In 1970, James P. Lodge at the National Center for Atmospheric Research predicted the end of the world by global cooling, which would lead to a new ice age. He was soon corroborated by NASA and other organizations. Then as now, they provided flawed historical data to prove their hypothesis and predicted wildly erratic weather patterns, rising sea levels, and famine. When none of these things occurred, they simply started saying the opposite, that the Earth was warming, and again predicted wildly erratic weather patterns, rising sea levels, and famine. One of the literal pioneers of the Ice Age theory, S.H. Schneider of NASA, switched sides completely and became one of the leading prophets for global warming, with publications, leadership positions, and appearances on all the news and talk shows. By 2007, the disaster predictions centered upon our running out of oil and the global upheaval which would follow. That event, running out of oil, was never going to happen any more than mankind ran out of the coal that came before oil or the firewood that came before coal. Man has always changed to better technology as it becomes available. Besides, in 2007, we had barely tapped oil shale, oil, and American tar sands are still untouched to this day. There for the taking whenever we decide to do so. By 2020, when oil pumping reached record highs, government called the resulting oil surplus a disaster in the making, and President Biden restricted oil drilling, again based on science. Following the behavior of the worst false prophets of the church, the climate change church does the exact same thing. It easily ignores its mistakes, flip-flops as necessary, and makes bad news out of good news. This does not disprove climate change. People are constantly predicting the end of the world, and one day, someone will guess right. What it does prove is that no doomsday scientist has been right so far. Not ever. Every climate change claim is eventually proven false, and the ones that have not been proven false have a money trail that leads back to bad data. When false prophets in the church predict the world is ending, most Christians consider them outliers and cults. But with scientists, the false climate predictions are mainstream. Unless governments stop enacting policies based on false science, there will never be a reason to believe the warnings. That will be a real shame when eventually the warnings happen to be real.